Hastings, England, December 1st, 1947. On a dark and rainy night, a man named Edward, 72 years of age, clings to his last and final breaths as his wife looks on in silence and fear. As death slowly begins to claim his body, Edward slips into a coma, his breathing growing weaker by the second. In his youth, Edward lived a life free of restraint and rules. His philosophy was do as thou wilt. It was even said that during a ritual seance, the words were whispered to him by the Egyptian god Horus as a way to encourage him on his path. But now, as an old man, clutching on to his last seconds of life, this philosophy had somehow failed him. Was life meant to be taken advantage of and used for one's own purposes? Or was it a test, able to discern the hearts of men and lead them to the basic tenets of life, love, and family? At this point, the only being in that room that would soon know for certain was Edward, dying slowly with his wife by his side. Suddenly, as he began to slip into the hereafter, a thunderstorm began to rise and rumble. Moments later, just as the loud clap of thunder rang through the sleepy town of Hastings, Aleister Crowley took his last breath, carried away by the god of his life. The only mystery that remained was which god was it? Welcome to the Halloween episode of the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast. Episode 14. Thank you for joining me on this somewhat special episode of the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast. During Halloween season, many of us take enjoyment in the fright of it all. The costumes and candies, the promise of fright being wrangled and ridiculed for one night a year. But what about those of us who indulge in that fear, even attempt to harness it for their own devices? This episode is about a man who attempted to do just that. To begin, Edward Alexander Crowley was born on October the 12th, 1875, to a devout evangelical couple in Royal Leamington Spa, England. By the time he was born, his father, Edward Sr., had already retired, wealthy from selling his brewery company, even though he considered drinking to be a sin. By the time Edward Jr. was born, his father was a traveling evangelist, teaching the ways of the Lord throughout the UK, ardently teaching the virtues of chastity and saintly life. As a child, his father would read one chapter of the Bible to his wife and son every day after breakfast, a practice which the young Edward appreciated, although in his school-age years, it caused him to be bullied by the other children. He wasn't allowed to wear expensive clothing or eat until full. Too much laughter or self-reflection. All of these were viewed as a sin, but slowly the young Edward began to rebel. By the age of 12, he was sent to a Christian boarding school, then a preparatory school, where he received harsh punishments for even the slightest infractions. And although the young Edward viewed these punishments as extreme and often unnecessary, he accepted the punishment, believing it would teach him humility and lead him to a chaste existence. All of that changed by the age of 11, when his father died of tongue cancer. From then on, Edward became hyper-rebellious, fighting, swearing, even dipping his toes into the smaller sins of theft and self-pleasure. After his father's death, Aleister found himself lost unable to find his own path in life. What he did discover was that he was left a large inheritance, which allowed him not only the freedom to explore his hobbies like mountain climbing and poetry, but also the means to engage in perversity and all of the sins he had been warned about throughout his childhood. And even a new hobby started to gain prominence in his life. This hobby was magic. While attending Cambridge, he gained an interest in poetry and chess, even winning several competitions, and the possibility of becoming a professional chess player seemed on the brink. But fate, it seems, had other plans. While living in St. Petersburg, Russia, in an attempt to learn the language, he became deathly ill. So ill that he often had fever dreams which increased in intensity by the day. It was during these fever dreams that Edward began to have devilish visions and speak to spirits chained within the underworld. At least that's what he thought. In reality, he was slowly developing an opioid habit, gained by ingesting drugs during occultic rituals, which he participated in often. Upon returning to London, he announced that his new name was now Aleister Crowley, and he began to seek out secret societies in order to fortify his mystical ambitions. Eventually, he was taken on by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a secret society known for participation in the occult with several levels of membership, which took years to attain. Members at the time included Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of the Sherlock Holmes series. After several disagreements with the members, Aleister began to venture out, buying a home in Loch Ness, Scotland, called Boleskine House, which was built on the ruins of a church, rumored to have burned down in a fire, killing all of its attendees. Aleister's drug use increased, as well as his depth in the occult. Also, several of his poems and short stories, which he wrote from time to time, began to be published underground, and although the reviews were mostly unfavorable, he continued writing intermittently, as well as publishing most of his life. It was at this time that he married a woman already engaged, named Rose Edith Kelly, after one day of courtship. It was a marriage of convenience, but during their honeymoon, two things happened. He began to love her, and during a seance in an Egyptian cave, Rose blacked out, only to awaken with a revelation. Aleister was sought after by the Egyptian god Horus. She had seen him in a vision, and his messenger Awis would begin to speak to Aleister soon. Thinking that she was lying or maybe pulling his leg, Aleister took her to a museum in Egypt and asked her to look around, and when she saw the god Horus, point to him. To his delight, she went over to an exhibit which showed a hieroglyph of Horus. The true irony was that there was no way for her to have known this was a depiction of Horus unless she truly had seen him. Another irony was that the number of the exhibit was 666. From that moment forward, Aleister engaged in the occult wholeheartedly, conducting week-long seances, sometimes even months long, and indulging in sexual rituals with multiple attendees. He even wrote a book entitled The Book of the Law, after receiving the contents over a 3-day drug binge, while, according to him, listening to the voice of Awis, his so-called guardian angel. He even welcomed a daughter with Rose, which eventually died of illness, a death that Aleister never truly forgave her for. And although they did have another daughter, Rose slipped into mania and was committed to an asylum, and the second daughter, Lola, was abandoned to a boarding home shortly thereafter. As fate would have it, his money began to dwindle to the point where he needed to earn money by any means necessary. With that in mind, he began to teach lessons from the Book of the Law to students for a fee, while forcing them to indulge in depraved acts. Acts too salacious for this podcast. But over time, as he aged and the thrill-seeking brought on by adulterous affairs and mountain climbing began to wane, he started to feel as though something was missing. The years became harsher, more extreme. Aleister found himself old and impoverished, heroin addicted, living in a boarding home alone, counting the days till his death. But a second chance at life came his way when a woman by the name of Deidre McClellan, several years younger, approached him, stating that she was a follower of his teachings and wanted to bear his child. Aleister agreed, and shortly thereafter a son was born. In his old age, Aleister doted on the boy named Aleister Jr. In reflection, he came to realize that throughout his life and travels and sexual exploration, what he really wanted was a family. But like all of us, when we reach a certain age, time was not his friend. And one stormy night, at the age of 72, Aleister Crowley passed away, leaving a dark legacy, which after his death became a pop cultural phenomenon. Artists like Led Zeppelin, David Bowie, John Lennon considered him to be some sort of dark prophet. The Beatles inserted his image onto the background of their famous album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Even the rapper Jay-Z was photographed wearing clothing with Aleister's famous saying, "Do as thou wilt," stitched into the fabric. In all, I believe that Aleister was a truly damaged soul. His childhood and strict upbringing forged nothing but the opposite of its intent, and although he is clearly celebrated in some circles to this day, his life remains one of the darkest stretches in time ever given a man. We'll be right back. Thank you for returning for this Halloween episode. I would like to say that there are multiple darker stories in regard to Aleister Crowley that I just actually refuse to put on this podcast. If you're interested, by all means, delve in as far as you would like, but I reached my depth. Now, we'll begin the second half of this episode with a short story which I believe has some sort of relation to the first half. This story continues with the spirit of Halloween, I suppose, and it goes by the name Bottle. To begin. Every October, the Amelia Earhart School for Girls, quickened with expectation, seeped in the gradual peppering of autumnal leaves and variations of red and brown, the chill of the air, and the fashion-forward girls taking advantage of the opportunity to adorn themselves with accessories, designer scarves, wool hats and mittens, allowing them to differentiate themselves from the drab and dreary uniforms they were forced to wear daily. Along with that came the annual Halloween costume contest. For 50 years, the school was renowned for the seriousness with which it took the competition. In fact, for some families, this was a major draw to enrollment. Past competition winners range from senators to 3 former state beauty pageant winners, and even a few CEOs proudly touted the Earhart School as their alma mater. No one was quite sure why the competition became a springboard to a more affluent life, but the one certain thing was that it was true. The pressure of a win was not lost on any of its participants. Over the years, there were rumors of families spending excessive amounts of effort and money to give their children a fighting chance. In the 80s, one girl was disqualified for releasing real-life bats during judging. To this day, several of the bats were never recovered. It was no wonder Maria Saucedo awakened one October morning with a headache stronger than her 14-year-old body had ever experienced. Unlike 98% of the girls who attended the Earhart School, Maria didn't come for money. Her family of 4 resided on the south side of town, in an apartment that could only be described as humble, far from the manicured lawns and faces of her classmates. She only attended the institution due to a scholarship given to her by the school's president. A year prior, she had written an essay about the importance of unity among women, which not only garnered national attention, but plucked her from the local PS 93 and enrolled her in the Earhart School by spring, due to her extraordinary use of the English language. Free from the dangers of the neighborhood, and thankfully, due to the scholarship, free from the $24,000 tuition. This was not lost on Maria. To get to the school, she needed to rise by 4 a.m., eat breakfast, dress, and take 2 city buses to arrive in time for homeroom. And to be clear, her attendance was perfect. For the first few months, her father, Nick, would join her on the journey. Along the way, he would fill her ears with stories of her late mother and how proud of her she would be, and how her brother and sister admired her, and how one day, when she became a big shot, she would come back to the neighborhood and run for office and change things. Maria rarely ever spoke during these travels. She was too tired most of the time, but her father's words resonated with her and determined her. Besides that, he let her sleep on her shoulder between transfers. Once she arrived at the school, she would say goodbye to her father, and through intermittent bouts of tiredness, soldier through the day and make the long journey home by herself, where she would be met by her father and siblings on the corner. Things went on this way for a while, until 2 things happened. Her father, after working several years as a construction worker, was promoted to foreman, and unfortunately for Maria, due to this promotion, she lost a guardian and gained a bully. To call Clarissa Hargrove popular would be an extreme understatement. Her mother was once one of the most powerful record executives in the industry, and her father had produced some of the most well-known songs of the 70s and 80s. There wasn't any musician of note that she didn't know personally, and oftentimes she would take long breaks from school to join her parents at various events and music conferences around the globe. By the age of 13, she signed a lucrative modeling contract which she squandered out of pure boredom, and now, at 17, her nights and weekends were spent posting videos, humble bragging about the exclusivity of her home in the Belridge Estates and sending evites to parties at the 25,000 square foot mansion where only the most popular could attend. As fate would have it, Maria and Clarissa had several AP classes together, and although Maria was usually the youngest in the room, she was always called upon by teachers to answer questions and give her perspective on matters outside of their scope of understanding. This infuriated Clarissa, silently at first, but over weeks, cruelty began to grow within her. When Maria would walk into class, Clarissa and her friends would giggle and scoff. At lunch, Clarissa would make it her business to comment about how some people should skip a meal or two and how Maria was probably stealing food to bring back home. Maria never replied. She never complained. And sometimes out of pure stress, she would even feign laughter. This only made matters worse, and by October, Maria had an enemy. Not because of something she said or did, but simply because a girl like Clarissa refused to believe that someone of Maria's lot in life had somehow managed to roam the same halls as her, enjoy the same education, and by no fault of her own, outpace her academically. This morning when Maria arrived on campus, signs and banners announcing the Halloween costume contest hung throughout the quad and corridors as she walked the halls. There was a buzz in the air. Conversations about costumes from Knightsbridge in London and makeup artists from Milan and Paris were heard sporadically between lockers and doorways. Some of the girls overtook corners and stairwells in order to post their excitement on social media, and even teachers huddled together in an anticipatory haze. The entire day was full of plans and plotting, but Maria was completely ignorant of the magnitude of the competition. not to mention what it could mean for the winner and their future. All of that changed by last period. As usual, Maria walked into class flanked by the whispers of Clarissa and her crew of sycophants. On the chalkboard, written in orange chalk, were the words costume ideas. Not only was this strange, considering this was a geometry class, but it was also annoying at this point. Maria didn't have the time or means to indulge in a conversation about expensive costumes, let alone endure an entire class about the matter. But before she could finish rolling her eyes, Clarissa, speaking with a faux Spanish accent, shouted, "Mija, I know what costume you should wear." Maria, avoiding eye contact, took her seat and faced forward, hoping Clarissa would leave her be, but 2 seconds later, "Mija, did you hear me? I'm trying to help you, compadre." Realizing this exchange wasn't going to end until Clarissa was acknowledged, Maria turned to her saying, "I'm listening, Clarissa." Clarissa smiled sheepishly and cleared her throat. "I'm going to bring you my maid's uniform so you can dress up like your dead mother. Spooky, huh?" Gasps, nervous laughter, and quiet filled the room, and before Maria could calm herself, she was 3 blows into beating Clarissa's face to a bloody pulp. 2 hours later, on the long bus ride home, Maria sat red-faced and in silence as her father, still dressed in his dirty work clothes, scolded her relentlessly. She had been suspended for a week, and according to Clarissa's father, a lawsuit was not out of the question. Nick began to further admonish her, but suddenly Maria broke into tears, sobbing uncontrollably, so much so that some of the passengers turned in her direction out of concern. Maria attempted to explain herself to her father through tears, but the only words that were decipherable were costume, Halloween, and stupid contest. Having never seen his daughter in such a state, Nick grabbed her hand and said nothing as the sound of the bus whirled them to their stop. As they stood to exit the bus, an attractive woman dressed in a black overcoat with grayish-red hair neatly tied in a bun tapped Nick on the shoulder and handed him a business card which read, "Veneers, Costumes, and Sundries." Nick stuffed the card into his pants pocket and exited the bus with Maria in tow. As the bus pulled off into the night, Maria looked to find the attractive woman staring at her with a smile that could only be described as pity. Maria nodded at the woman, who returned the gesture as the bus shrank down the street in a cloud of exhaust. The next morning, Maria awakened to the sound of her siblings knocking at her door. As she stood to her feet, a letter written in her father's handwriting fell from her chest and landed on the floor. Maria retrieved the letter from the ground to read, "I love you. I do not blame you. Clean the house. Take care of the little ones. 14-hour shift today. Love, Dad." A sigh escaped Maria's lips as she opened her door to find her brother David, age 5, and sister Diana, age 8, standing at the threshold, dressed in pajamas, bright, brown-eyed, and beautiful. As luck would have it, the children's clothes were already set to the side, so Maria's only responsibility was to feed, dress, and send them off to school, which she did with relative ease. Once alone, she cleaned the small apartment to the best of her ability and studied for a few hours until tedium got the best of her. In an attempt to find something to do with the time on her hands, she decided to go above and beyond and wash clothes. Maria hated doing laundry, but she remembered how her mother always made the task feel like an event. Music playing, singing, as she separated the darks from the whites, the play clothes from the school clothes, her father's never-ending hoard of t-shirts and basketball shorts. Maria did it all with the spirit of her mother buttressing her every move. As she filled the last basket with her father's work clothes, the card given to him by the red-haired woman from the night before fell from his pants pocket and landed atop her foot. Maria picked up the card, paused and reflected on the pity-filled smile she was given. A curiosity sparked within her, and before she could reason with herself, Maria exited the apartment building, card in hand, searching for Veneers, Costumes, and Sundries, with a faint glint of rebellion churning in her belly. After walking for an hour, Maria arrived at an abandoned storefront, which, according to the card, was the location of Venera's shop. To her surprise, the doors were padlocked, and the only evidence of humanity was a few homeless men loitering nearby. Believing she had been tricked, Maria turned to make the trip back home. But as she walked, she turned her head to an alley where the same attractive woman from the bus was midway into tossing a bag of trash into a dumpster. A rush of excitement coursed through Maria's body, as tunnel vision prompted her to make a beeline towards the woman with reckless abandon. Before her, brandishing the card, she greeted the woman, calling her Venera, which the woman quickly corrected. Venera was my grandmother. My name is Esperanza. And you? Maria, she said with bated breath. The store is empty. Are you still in business? Esperanza explained that the store had recently closed for good due to a severe lack of customers, and although she was in the midst of relocating, she did have a few items upstairs in her possession she'd be willing to let go if it were for a worthy cause. Maria thanked Esperanza, who invited her into the building, and Maria entered without a moment's hesitation. As they walked the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment, Esperanza removed the pin from her hair bun, releasing a reddish mane that dropped to the back of her knees. From behind, Maria reveled at the length and shimmer of her hair as it swayed from side to side with impunity. Even the sillage that radiated from her perfume enraptured Maria in a hypnotic trance. When the apartment door opened, 6 black cats greeted them with purrs and mews. Esperanza introduced the cats as her babies and asked Maria to sit as she headed to the back. Amid several taped cardboard boxes and moving supplies, the decor of the apartment was impeccable. A grandfather clock ticked triumphantly in the corner, Persian rugs, green velvet couches and oak end tables, Victorian-era armoires and Tiffany lamps speckled throughout the seating area as an homage to a time and style long forgotten by modernity. Maria sat in silence, under the watchful eyes of the cats, until Esperanza returned with 2 cups of tea and 4 blueberry scones, which Maria happily accepted. Seated across from her, Esperanza asked Maria to explain the cause of her tears the night before. Maria went over the events of the past year, her mother's passing, and the cruelty she endured at the hands of Clarissa and her followers. After she finished, Esperanza exhaled deeply and crossed to her armoire, which she opened, retrieving a large leather carpet bag. After placing it on the floor, Esperanza opened the bag, pulled out a blank mask made of hemp, and tossed it onto Maria's lap. Before Maria could respond, Esperanza again reached into the bag, retrieved a small blank bottle of perfume, and handed it to her. Esperanza went on to explain that the items in her hand would give her the ability to take on the voice, visage, and physicality of any living human. Esperanza made it a point to stress the importance of the phrase, any living human. No historical figures, no imaginary creations were available to her, due to the fact that their life force was a product of imagination and could not be used. Maria chuckled at the thought, believing this was some con or gimmick used to sell her wares. But to further prove her point, Esperanza crossed to Maria, took the mask and perfume, and stood before an antique mirror, inviting Maria to join her. Maria stood next to Esperanza as she sprayed herself with the aromatic perfume, placed the mask upon her face, and in a muffled voice said, "Name someone. Anyone among the living." Maria, still smiling, took a moment to think before saying, "David, my little brother." Esperanza corrected her immediately, saying, "I've never seen him. Name someone common, someone everyone knows." Maria contemplated some of the more well-known figures in the world until an idea sparked her brain. "Beyonce," she said with a smirk. Good, said Esperanza. "Pay attention." Before her eyes, Esperanza's entire being morphed into Beyonce. Her face, her tone, her voice, even her figure. In shock, Maria shouted out the names of several entertainers and public figures. Each time, Esperanza would transform into them within seconds. Enthused, Maria began to call out more names, but Esperanza, who seemed to grow weak due to the transformation, stopped her, saying, "Enough. You see that it works." Esperanza sprayed herself again, saying, "Remember to remove the mask, spray once more, and you're free. Now take these items, compete with your classmates, and when you win this competition of yours, be proud. You are too young to be burdened by sorrow. Happy Halloween." Handed the mask, Maria inquired about the cost, but Esperanza insisted she take them for free, saying her reward was the happiness of the forsaken. Maria thanked her for the assistance, finished her tea and scones, and returned home moments before her brother and sister arrived from school. That night, Nick arrived to find the children fed and asleep in their rooms. On the stove was a decent meal prepared by Maria, and in his bedroom his clothes were now washed, folded, and placed in their respective drawers and shelves. Wanting to thank her, Nick went to Maria's room, but when the door opened, he found her at her desk, head down in a book, fast asleep. Nick picked up his daughter, placed her into her bed, and kissed her good night. A week later, Maria returned to school as usual, careful to keep as much distance between her and Clarissa as possible. This wasn't difficult. Over the past week, she had gained a reputation of sorts, and Clarissa, now on the tail end of a healing black eye, seemed to have learned her lesson. She was quiet in class and ate lunch off campus. A few students noticed that her social media had even ceased. Unlike the week prior, Maria was greeted with an assortment of hellos and waves as she moved from class to class. A few teachers even patted her on the back and asked how she was holding up. A calm washed over Maria as she felt a sense of welcome for the first time since enrollment. Over the coming days, news reporters started to interview the students sporadically, and the campus was now transformed into a complete Halloween spectacle. Scarecrows, carved pumpkins, and eerie music piped in through speakers. The entire school was adorned in orange and black. Secretly, Maria held a slight embarrassment about the spectacle, but with the competition a mere 2 days away, she needed to test out the gift given to her by Esperanza before showtime. That night, as her family slept in their beds, Maria stared before her mirror, perfume and mask in hand. After taking a deep breath, she sprayed herself with the perfume, placed the mask over her head, and focused her thoughts. Moments later, standing before the mirror, she transformed into the first being that popped into her head. In her case, this was Esperanza. Maria began tossing her long hair about, laughing and posing with a glee she hadn't experienced in years. Moments later, she thought of her dad, and within seconds, she became him, dressed in his work clothes with the same sweet sadness he carried in his eyes. After a moment of thought, she started to focus her mind on her mother. But nothing happened. She tried again, thinking of her smile, her laugh, even her touch, but to no avail. Immediately she remembered she could only transform into a living being. Spraying herself once more, Maria removed the mask and collapsed in bed with mixed emotions. She was pleased that the mask worked, but saddened that no matter how hard she tried, her mother would remain an untouched hope, frozen in time and memory. Soaking in bed, the cruelty of Clarissa's words began to replay in her mind. The laughter that followed, the shame of being suspended. Something within her wanted revenge, although she wasn't sure how to bring it about. Minutes later, a mischievous grin formed on her face. Again, she found herself standing before the mirror, perfume and mask at the ready, and focusing her thoughts. When her eyes opened, she was now Clarissa in all of her obnoxious glory. At first, she mimicked her, making silly sounds and faces, but within seconds the folly of this started to lose its luster. Darker thoughts began to rise within her. Maria wanted more than private ridicule. In her heart, what she truly wanted was payback. As her family slept, Maria stuffed the perfume and mask into her book bag and snuck off into the night. On a nearly empty bus, Maria logged on to social media and to Clarissa's page. For 15 minutes, she scrolled through each picture and video until she was able to piece together an approximation of where Clarissa lived within the Bell Ridge estates. 30 minutes later, after exiting the bus and waiting for the coast to clear, she dug into her book bag, sprayed and masked herself, and instantly became Clarissa. Upon arrival at the gated community, she casually strolled before the guards with the same arrogance she was certain carried Clarissa through life, waved, and without question, the iron rod gates creaked open and she entered the community under moonlit silence. Walking the neighborhood in the dark was a surreal experience. Back home, a girl of her age would be crippled with fear, on edge, almost expecting the worst, but here, shielded from the common folk, nestled in opulence and privilege, the thought of harm seemed like a myth. After walking for a few blocks, she stood before an ornate brass sign, the same sign from Clarissa's multiple social media posts, which read, "The Hargroves." The gate was far too high to climb, and based on the security camera aimed directly at her, Maria knew she had to take a chance. Nervously, she pressed her trembling finger on the call button. Seconds later, a woman's voice, wilted and weak, chimed through the intercom asking, "Clarissa, why are you outside?" Staying in character and taking a shot in the dark, Maria answered, "Mom, just open the gate." Maria waited and waited and waited even longer until finally the gate sprang open to reveal a behemoth of a home, decked in motion-sensing path lights and an array of security cameras. The property itself was much more massive than the internet could ever convey. A circular cobblestone driveway with a concrete statue of some historically dead white man gawked at her from the center. The facade of the home was a 3-storied brick estate which stretched as far as her eyes could see. Even the walk to the front door took a full minute before she reached the entry. When she entered the home, it was cloaked in darkness, save for a few art lights which illuminated paintings and sculptures she never knew existed. Each of her tepid steps echoed between the walls like a pebble falling through a chasm, and all Maria could think about was getting caught and what it would do to her life and her father's pride. After a few more seconds of wandering, Maria arrived at a chandeliered set of circular steps and made her way upward. When she reached the top of the stairs, her eyes fell to a set of large mahogany wood double doors, one of them slightly opened. When she looked inside, she saw Clarissa's father, seated alone in silk pajamas at a large wooden desk, lit by a single recessed ceiling light. In his hand, a bottle of what she could only assume was expensive liquor, 3/4 of it already consumed. His face was weather-beaten and miserable, staring at the wall as if he expected it to somehow move. Continuing on, she came across another set of double doors, this time closed shut. Placing her ear to the door, Maria listened as the muffled coughs and moans of a woman's voice piqued her interest. Carefully, she turned the knob, cracking the door open just enough to find a thin and balding woman lying alone in a king-sized bed surrounded by pill bottles and syringes. Paying close attention to the woman's face, Maria surmised that the sight before her was Clarissa's mother, removed from the commercial known as social media and most certainly near death. Something about seeing her this vulnerable, this delicate, seemed wrong and tawdry. Visions of her own mother's last moments fluttered in her mind. The fatigue, the delirium, the discoloration, the cancer, all of it came rushing back with a force so strong that the only thing Maria could do to keep from sobbing was close the door. After gathering herself, Maria proceeded towards the final door at the end of the hallway. On the face of the door was a letter C, raised, bronzed, and embedded like a scar. Again, Maria pressed her ear to the door, only to hear a dull nothing saturating from the opposite side. Believing that the room was empty, Maria turned the knob and entered to find Clarissa, sleeping soundly in a dimly lit room fit for a princess. Pink and baby blue everything, blankets, furniture, and wallpaper, dolls and cheerleading trophies set on bookshelves instead of books. Maria marveled at the immaturity the room held, how it seemed to engulf her and Clarissa in a time and mentality long gone. Moving closer to Clarissa, Maria tilted her head ever so slightly as she gazed upon her sleeping bully, her furrowed brow, the naked exposure waiting for her to do something, anything, even the unthinkable. At that moment, Maria questioned herself. What exactly was the plan? In truth, she had none, and as pity welled up from within, she turned her head to find Clarissa's costume, draped over a desk chair, still wrapped in plastic, dormant and unprotected. From the bottom, she could see a furry brown tail with a white tip descending to the floor, but in its entirety a mystery still remained. 2 long and silent strides later, Maria snaked over to the costume and slowly unsheathed it from its wrapping, under the sound of her own beating heart. Once unwrapped, surprise and disappointment washed over her. The costume was certainly expensive, well made. A shipping tag from Japan proved that point, but it certainly wasn't a winner. It was infantile, thoughtless, a simple rendition of a fox. A sigh followed by a chuckle escaped Maria's lips as she set the costume back in its rightful place. Suddenly, the serenity of the discovery was disturbed by 2 taps on her shoulder. Startled, Maria turned to find Clarissa, hyperventilating and confused, staring at what was her clone. Before Maria could respond, a scuffle ensued. Clarissa clawing and screaming, Maria fighting to get away. In the melee, Clarissa managed to rip the book bag from Maria's back, hitting the wooden floor with a clash and bang, freeing her from her grip and allowing her to escape the room just as Clarissa's father entered with a drunken shriek. As Maria exited the mansion in a flurry of fright and relief, Clarissa and her father stood silent, staring at one another in disbelief, trying to wrap their brains around what they had both witnessed. Outside, running full speed, Maria crossed the cobblestone pathway, leaped and pulled her way over the gate, and dashed into the night under the faint sound of an alarm blaring in the distance. Shaken in her room, Clarissa rummaged through the book bag, probing for any clue of who the intruder could have possibly been, but all she discovered was a set of keys, $2 in change, a geometry book, and a shattered bottle of perfume. After sneaking past the guards, Maria exited Bell Ridge Estates and onto the main road where she attempted to remove the mask from her face, but unfortunately for her, it didn't budge. Scratching and tearing at her skin, Maria once again made an attempt, but the mask was now seared to her flesh. A palpable dread engulfed her as she searched her pockets for the perfume, but after realizing she had abandoned her book bag during the escape, she fell to her knees in a panic, wailing into the night, devastated at the true cost of her so-called revenge. For hours, Maria walked towards home, tearful and tortured by the calamity she had caused. As she walked, thoughts of her father and siblings, Clarissa and her father, even Clarissa's dying mother, haunted her every step. Unbeknownst to Maria, with each thought, her face and body transformed into every living individual that crossed her mind. By sunrise, Maria arrived at her South Side neighborhood, thinking only of how she could get to Esperanza as soon as possible. As she approached her home, her father exited the building in an incoherent daze, flanked by 2 police officers doing their best to calm him. Maria approached Nick and hugged him, but he shouted at her and pushed her away. She attempted to embrace him again, but the officers grabbed her, asking her father, did he recognize her? Nick glanced at her for a mere second before shaking his head no. From there, an officer grabbed her by the wrist and commanded her to move along. In confusion, Maria pleaded to her father, saying, "Papa, it's me, Maria." A disgust she had never seen came upon his face, and the officers forcefully shoved her to the side. In disarray, Maria glanced at her reflection in a nearby window, only to see that she was not herself. In fact, the reflection staring back at her was now Esperanza. To this day, at the stroke of midnight, on every Halloween for as long as anyone could recall, a figure could be seen pacing before the abandoned building which once housed Venera's costumes and sundries, waiting for someone who would never come. There were always a variety of descriptions. Some say a little boy or a little girl. Others saw a construction worker or a balding woman, even a cheerleader. The one constant was the wailing which echoed through the night, only to disappear with the figure by sunrise. Thank you for joining us on this special Halloween episode of the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast. In essence, this wasn't an episode with some grand meaning. It was simply a Halloween shebangy bang. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it. I had fun making it. This has been a very long episode. So to get to the point, if you have any suggestions, concerns, questions, you can always reach me at swtomail@gmail.com. Again, that is swtomail@gmail.com. I do appreciate all of my listeners, especially the new ones in America and Europe, or wherever you may happen to be. As always, be mindful of the stories you tell yourselves. But this week, just, have a happy Halloween. How about that? Until next time.